Hello and welcome back to the lecture on macroeconomics for managers. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the relatedness between microeconomics and macroeconomics. Now, in the previous lectures, we spoke about in detail about the principles that we study in microeconomics and macroeconomics. And it is true that these principles are kind of the foundation for all the different models and theories that we build in microeconomics and macroeconomics. And the study in economics, to a large extent, involves understanding these principles. Uh, the study of microeconomics and macroeconomics is also very critical in terms of decision making. And if we see all these models and theories that we are building, is actually the intended purpose is to facilitate decision making. Now, this decision making could be at individual level, could be at farm level, or it is something at the aggregate economy level. Okay. So when we actually talk about microeconomics, we have seen the decision making has been mostly at the individual level or the farm level. Okay, so we have spoken about, say, demand curve, right? Individual demand curve, or we have spoken about the supply curve for a farm, right? Now, how did we do that? So if you remember, when we did the demand curve, we had, say, we received, we had some idea about individuals indifference curve. Say this two goods bit A and B, and individual has an indifference curve like this, and he also has a budget line, and this budget line is like this. Has to be some point where it touches the indifference curve. And when we have this, so we have this basket of A and B, which this person A, which this person can actually buy, right? Given his limited budget he has, right? The scarce environment he's operating in, he can buy so and so amount of A and B. And when we add up all these different indifference curves for that person and different budget lines, we will actually have the demand curve for that individual, right? For a farm, we have the supply curve. We derive the supply curve. So we had like the cost of inputs and other costs, and we see that there is a price in the existing price in the market. Let's say in a perfectly competitive market, where the price is just constant. So let's say the price is like this, and this person and the cost. Say let's draw like a straight line cost curve. Say this is the cost, and he is able to supply at this price. Okay. So again, you can think of different price level and different cost for inputs, and you can basically get a supply curve for the farm, right? So that is how you kind of derive the supply curve for the farm. And we have seen in microeconomics how we do that. So essentially, the reason we are kind of speaking it again is that in microeconomics and macroeconomics, it's essentially is a science of decision making for an individual entity, right? So in macroeconomics, we actually do the same but at an aggregate level. So, say supply and demand. So, instead of individual demand or the individual farm supply, we kind of talk about the entire supply curve of the economy. We call it aggregate supply curve, or we call it aggregate demand curve. So, entire demand in the economy. So, that is the beauty in beauty of microeconomics, macroeconomics relation. Like you take all the individual entities and you sum them up, and what you get is basically the things that you study in macroeconomics, right? So macroeconomics is basically some sort of, to understand it, we can say like it's an economics with aggregation. So aggregation is the term. So you basically aggregate things to kind of reach from micro to macro. Okay. Um, So, for example, in microeconomics, we talk about individual income. So, when I'm talking about this budget line, I'm essentially talking about the income, right? Now, in macroeconomics, instead of saying individual income, we say national income, like, all the income of all the person that we have. And that is basically sort of represented by gross domestic product, GDP, which we're going to learn in detail. Um, in microeconomics, we'll talk about, say, labor supply, labor demand, the labor cost. So it's like, the sort of supply demand curve that you have studied. But in macroeconomics, we'll talk about like at aggregate level, the unemployment rate of the economy, for example, right? So that's an aggregate phenomena. So that is how the topics differ at the level of aggregation, basically, between when you talk about micro and macroeconomics. So that is one aspect of macroeconomics, that we actually aggregate things. The other aspect where it differs is that macroeconomics is essentially a top-down approach. The fact that you start everything after you aggregate things, it becomes by default it becomes a top down approach, because the variables, you are creating new variables. So GDP is a new thing for you, unemployment rate is a new variable, right? Interest rate is something that is observed only at the national level, right? um, Consumer price index, these are all like, national level, state level, you see different things, but these are all at the macro level. And because these are at the macro level, it is always top down. You always see the interaction at the top, and how that interactions are going to, say, influence the economy, say GDP, your inflation, your interest rate, right? And all this, unemployment and all these macro variables, they actually interact at the top, and we kind of try to understand what is happening because of that. And we're going to see in detail how what we really do here. So we kind of try to understand the relatedness of all these variables. So it is more like there are multiple, like it's a complex picture. There's a complex economic activities, and in these complex economic activities, we actually try to see how these variables, how these macro variables are related to each other, you know, and that's what we are going to see in macroeconomic modeling, and we'll talk about macroeconomic modeling in a while. The third part is, as I said earlier, that there might be micro and macro. There are, like there are differences in the sort of levels of aggregation, and whether it's a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach. So macro is top-down and micro is bottom-up approach. But despite that, these two are intricately related. Okay, both micro and macro are intricately related. So what I mean by that is, so things that we see in macro is actually derived from micro. We just saw that, like the demand curve. We say, like how we get the aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve. It is coming from individual level. Uh, so similarly, again, like micro is also sort of influenced by macro. For example, like we can think about the decision making in household and decision making, like things which are existing at a macro level. For example, a household may decide how much to consume, right? So that is actually dependent on, like, well, so that is actually dependent on what is the decision of the household on how much to save. And how much to save is actually decided by the prevailing interest rate in the country. If the interest rate is high, households would like to save more because the return to that sort of that saving is going to be high, and the interest rate is going to be high if the economic scenario is in general good, and the there are a lot of investments happening. There is a need for the capital, and as the interest rate gets automatically high. So this macro phenomena is actually sort of influencing the household decision, as in how much to consume and how much to save, right? So basically, we can write that this microeconomics is actually influences macroeconomics. So, for example, supply demand to aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and similarly, macroeconomics influences microeconomics. And the example we gave was that, um, say the consumption, the say interest rate is actually deciding household consumption, right? Household. Let me make it a little small. Household consumption. So that's in a brief how we can sort of try to understand the macroeconomics and microeconomics are related. And I'll end this talk here, and we'll see further how they're related. And again, as I said, we are going to see a lot of interaction between these subjects when we, keep on building models, and we keep on discussing those models and theories. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the vocabularies and variables that we generally talk about in macroeconomics, and how do we build models out of that. Thanks.